morning. Good morning. Thank you. This beautiful spring day, we are thrilled to have you all here for this symposium on licensure. And I'd like to welcome all of you. Some of you I know have come from quite a distance. Anybody here from Hofstra, Long Island? Long Island folks? College of New Rochelle? There they are. Okay. And where else have people come from? Westchester? Okay. Upstate? Putnam. Okay. All right. Albany. Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to welcome all of you. I'd like to welcome especially the officers of the New York Art Therapy Association and also the Westchester Art Therapy Association for co-hosting and collaborating with us on this symposium. I'd also like to welcome our special guest, Dr. David Hamilton, who's come down from Albany. We're very pleased to co-sponsor this event, and we're honored to have Dr. Hamilton here with us. He was here a couple of weeks ago for another symposium, and it's great to have him back on campus. I'm Patricia St. John. I'm the director of the art therapy programs here, and I'd like to thank everybody on my campus who helped to make this event what it is. I'd like to thank housekeeping, who set up this beautiful area, security, who helped all of you get a parking place, I hope, and yeah, and dining services, who put out the beautiful food for us to have this morning. Before we get underway, I'd like to give you just a few housekeeping details. Restrooms, always important. They're down the hall to the very, very end. There is also a drinking fountain down there too. We are being videotaped over here. So I'd like, if we can, keep ambient noise down to a minimum, and please turn off cell phones. I guess you all have done that. And then after the event this morning, we encourage you to stay on campus, enjoy the campus. You'll notice that some flowers are starting to come up. It's starting to turn into spring. We have 2 student exhibits in the galleries across the street, and then the Castle Gallery is the 3rd building on your right as you go down Castle Place, and there's an exhibit there as well. If you'd like to stay for lunch, the cafeteria downstairs is serving food. And there is actually a Starbucks on campus at the library building, which is the next one down, going down Castle Place. So that's enough talking for me. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Jody Price-Littell, who is president of the New York Art Therapy Association. I'll get it right. And she will announce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat, and thank you for everything you've done with NIADA to help facilitate us having this event this year. We have done it at CNR before, and we like to rotate it between different venues so that as many people can be exposed to our licensure event that we bring to you each year. A couple of quick thank yous as well, in addition to Pat, would be Dr. Hamilton. Thank you again for coming to speak to us. It's always very important that we keep everybody in the field, not just students, but current professionals, new professionals, seasoned professionals, abreast of all the changes that are going on within New York, because we do have a lot of stuff going on. Sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming, but we like to really bring the information straight to you, break it down, and of course, Dr. Hamilton has always been very gracious to answer everybody's questions and take his time to really go through that with everyone. In addition, Samantha Hasher, Advisory Board and current Governmental Affairs Chair, did the bulk of the work. She was the chair for this event, so she really helped to put this all together. Thank you. And to Westchester Art Therapy Association, I don't see where Tara went. Oh, there you are. Tara, the president of the Westchester Art Therapy Association. They have graciously donated the food that we have today, which is delicious. Thank you. And they are a new chapter that are doing wonderful things. They have great events coming up. One in particular, you can get the flyer outside on the table. It is called A World of Possibility, Characters, Narratives, and Murals, and it is on Sunday, May 4th, 2014. I myself am hoping to attend, and you could also get some more information about membership for what for WADA, for short, Westchester Art Therapy Association. We do encourage that if you are a NIADA member, you can also become a WADA member, get information on what's going on with their events coming up, and that's that for WADA. And let's see. Sorry.
Thank you.
Did I cover everything? Okay, excellent. And Tara can obviously answer any questions that you may have later regarding that. And food services, thank you for bringing everything, and all of our technology services that are taping the event for today. We are hoping to be able to offer this event for those that were not able to make it, to offer it online. So we'll keep you posted when and if that becomes available. A couple of more quick updates. I want to definitely get to as much time as possible with Dr. Hamilton, but some upcoming events that we have. We have a couple of spots that opened up for our Draftsman Congress event that is coming up next Sunday. It's a very exciting event that's at the new museum. It is limited space, but 2 spaces did recently open up for it, so you can feel free to find myself or somebody else on the board and sign up for that. And we have Children's Mental Health Awareness Day coming up in May, so if anybody has anything special that they're doing for Children's Mental Health Awareness Day with art therapy, please let NIADA know and we'll make sure to publicize that for you. And then the conference is coming up at the ADA conference every year. We like to do a mixer for our New York members where you can come together, meet, hang out. Even though we're out of state, we're still a community together. So that's free for all members. Come to Texas and hang out. Details will be coming up for that. And then lastly, I just want to introduce the board members. If everybody can take a look over here. We've got Gabrielle Grimaldi Bellatieri. She is our, let's see, e-group moderator. She is our website moderator and membership chair. That's right. I want to make sure I get all. She's our busy lady over there. We have Joyce Bellish sitting down in the red, and she's our recording secretary. Susan Boxer-Capel right there, who is our delegate to the chapter through ADA, and she keeps in touch with everything we need to know for ADA. Sam Hasher, who I already introduced, our governmental affairs chair. Dana Whedon, my second in command as president-elect, future NIADA president. Susan Paradise Goodman, our elections committee chair, sitting right in front, next to Alicia Rappaport-Zubrow, and she is our corresponding secretary, next to Deborah Adler, our archivist. And Michelle all the way in the back, who is our student liaison, who I'm sure you heard much from, getting all you students to attend, so we're really grateful to have her reaching out to all of the graduate programs and getting everybody involved. So I think Mary, which is hiding. You're all spread out today. There you are. Mary is our treasurer, and she takes care of all things financial and then some. She's fantastic as well. So without further ado, we have Dr. David Hamilton from the Office of the Professions coming to discuss with us the licensure ins and outs, as well as all of our updates and new changes that are coming up. Please give a round of applause.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, Patricia. It's good to be back here, especially this time there's no snow on the ground. I think we had a couple feet to get through in early March. I'm going to try and cover a lot of areas today, and I got somewhat of a sense of where people are from when you answered Patricia's questions. Just by a show of hands, how many of you are students here? Okay. All right. How many of you are graduates who are working on getting your experience right now? Okay, a couple. And then how many of you are licensed? Okay. Licensed and potential supervisors. Let's see. Okay. The goals for today are to give you an overview of licensure, what we mean by licensure, how it protects the public, and how it protects you. And part of that will be talking about the education requirements for an individual who wants to get licensed as a creative arts therapist. We'll look at the requirements in New York for licensure, discuss issues related to public protection and professional practice, because again, that's why we license people, is to protect the public. and we'll have time starting at noon to answer all of your questions. In your folder today, you've got a copy of the slides, but you've also got some index cards that, as I'm going through the presentation, if you could write down your questions on those cards. Samantha and others, I think, will be collecting those, and then I'll work from those written questions to try and answer all of those. And I'm going to make sure we leave plenty of time for that. The education law establishes the licensed professions. I'm putting more than 50 now. When I came to work for the department in 2001, I think there was 39 professions maybe, and now we have moved over 50. There were two new professions that just went into effect April 1 of this year for behavior analysts. So the legislature has continued to create licensed professions. All the professions fall under the authority of the Board of Regents, and the Regents are elected by a joint session of the legislature, as you probably heard more about than you ever did before this year. And they represent different parts of the state, and they're responsible not only for the Common Core and P-12 education, but also for the licensed professions. They have a professional practice committee that meets every month to hear about issues related to the professions. They're the ones who can take disciplinary action. The education department is the administrative arm. I'm employed by the education department, but I'm appointed by the Board of Regents as the executive secretary of the State Board for Mental Health Practitioners. And I work with the state board, which is comprised of 3 licensees in each of the 4 professions under the law: mental health counselors, marriage and family therapists, creative arts therapists, and psychoanalysts. And as well as 3 public members who are not licensed in those professions but are consumers of professional services, and a psychiatrist who by law has to be on the board as well. And the state board helps in a number of ways, including helping us to develop law, the regulations and the policies to implement the law, but also the disciplinary process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Very brief history of more than 40 years of legislative activity. But bottom line, until recently, anyone in New York could practice psychotherapy, creative arts therapy, clinical social work, whatever you wanted to call it. There was no license required. That changed in 2002 when legislation was enacted that created a restricted title and scope of practice for creative arts therapists, as well as the mental health counselors, marriage and family therapists, and psychoanalysts, and created 2 new social work professions of licensed masters and licensed clinical social worker, and a scope for psychology, because even though psychology and social work as certified social workers were title protected, meaning you had to be licensed by the department to use that title, the scope was not restricted. So anyone could hold out that they could do an IQ test or do psychotherapy or do anything else. But that changed when these laws were adopted. So starting in 2005, we could issue licenses to mental health practitioners, and as of January 1, 2026, for the most part, the practice is restricted to those people who are licensed. This chart shows the number of people that we have licensed since we started this whole process about 10 years ago. In 2005, we got our first licensees, about 120. Most of those were under grandparenting provisions that would expire in 2006. In 2006, we did the bulk of the work. We had 936 new licensees. And then, as you see, we dropped down since then to 93 in 2007, and down to the 70s for a couple of years. And there's a little bit of a cycle. We come up, about 120, 128 last year. This is part of the growth of the profession. Before, when there was no licensure requirements, there were no schools that led to a degree. Schools had to get approved, and then it's going to change your environment, because now students have to come through the school, they have to complete supervised experience, they have to pass an exam. So this is building. We are continually seeing new programs and developing programs across the entire the scope of all the professions. This slide is actually It should say licensed mental health practitioners. That's what was throwing me. So from the start of this process in 2005 to the end of 2013, about 5,800 people have been licensed in one of these 4 professions. And again, you see the spike in 2006 and 2007 when we were grandparenting, and then the drop, but then the slow growth back up as people move into these new professions. So these are still relatively young professions. Physicians have been licensed since the 1890s. Nurses, pharmacists, some others since the early 1900s. So there are a lot more mature professions around, and this is how a profession develops and grows. So let's talk a little bit about the education for licensure. In order to get licensed, you have to enroll at a master's degree program that leads to licensure as a creative arts therapist. The law is very specific as to the requirements that must be included in this education program, and the department registers programs that lead to licensure. So we've registered the program that leads to licensure as a creative arts therapist at the College of New Rochelle. We've registered a program at Hofstra. We've registered a program at Pratt. When we register it, that means the school is going to comply with the laws and the regulations. They're going to make sure that you, as a student, you complete all the coursework that you need to be able to graduate and start practice at an entry level. That also means we don't have to look at your transcripts. We don't have to have any questions about whether or not you met the education requirements. All we need is a form submitted from your school, what we call Form 2, where they say you've received your degree, and then we can move forward with the next steps in the process. Which, again, your school has provided all the coursework. They've given you a course somewhere in your curriculum in the 2 hours of mandatory child abuse identification and reporting. So if you see suspected child abuse or neglect, you know who to call, you know how to handle that type of incident. And from a registered program, you're great. But if you graduated from a program that wasn't registered, say it was one out of New York State, then we're going to have to make sure that we evaluate a program based on the individual's transcript and the education that they completed to see if it's the equivalent. Because again, our law is very specific in terms of the education requirements that have to be met by the student. And that includes a 500-hour supervised internship, where the student is placed under a qualified supervisor who is in a setting that's authorized to provide creative arts therapy services, psychotherapy services. Supervisors licensed as a creative arts therapist or licensed in one of several other professions that can practice psychotherapy, and the person is competent in creative arts therapy. And as I was talking to some of you before, it's not an LCSW who just has some coloring books and paint in their office for kids who show up. It's someone who actually has had some training in creative arts therapy. And that's the question you need to ask when you're a graduate of school and you're looking for a supervisor in an employment setting, is who is employed in the setting that's either a licensed creative arts therapist or is competent and authorized to practice creative arts therapy. The school, again, is responsible for checking out all of those things before they place students. We get a question every now and then, especially schools downstate that might draw students from New Jersey or Connecticut. Can the student be placed in an internship outside of New York? Yes, they can, as long as the school can guarantee that that student's completing a similar experience. But because the scope is, the profession is restricted, a student at a school outside of New York State can only come into New York if the school is accredited by the American Art Therapy Association, and therefore we know they met our requirements, or if they've applied to the department and we've registered them to place students. And there's a program in the Southwest U.S. that is an online program that offers a master's degree. They have one in professional counseling, and they have one in art therapy or creative art therapy, where they want to place students in New York. We make them demonstrate that they've got adequate safeguards and protections before they can place those students here, before we can give them permission, because we want to make sure that any student who's in any setting is appropriately supervised, and we want to make sure that there's an accountability that if they're not placed in appropriate settings and something goes wrong, that we know who's responsible, the school that, that has placed them here. Again, because we're trying to protect the public. We don't want just anyone telling students, come to New York and find a setting and do whatever you want, and we'll count it toward your internship. We want to make sure it's a quality, acceptable education process. Okay, requirements for licensure. These are all in the law. They're pretty straightforward and simple. You've got to apply to the department. You've got to pay an application fee. That application fee of $371 is $175 of application fee, which means our review of all your qualifications, and the remainder is $196 is a registration fee. So once your license is issued, you'll be registered to practice for 3 years. As I said earlier, the school will verify your degree. There's a memo in your packet today that I sent out to the school and to Samantha and to others that sets out some of the questions you might have as students and the process you might follow as you go through this. Because you're going to need to complete supervised experience under a limited permit. Limited permit is essentially a temporary license. You're going to have to pass an acceptable licensing exam. And there are actually several ways you can pass the licensing exam in this profession. You can take the American Art Therapy Credentialing Board examination based on our approval. Or if you were in music therapy, there's a certification board in music therapy. Or if someone was in any of the other therapies like drama or dance, movement, they would have to do case narratives online that are scored by members of the board as if they were essentially a written case presentation to determine if they passed the examination requirement. And the child abuse course was again part of the education program here. And then an applicant has to be of good moral character, as does a licensee. So what's good moral character? Well, first it's required before we can give you a permit or a license. When you fill out your application for licensure, there are 4 questions on there that we refer to sort of as the good moral character questions. Have you ever been convicted of a crime, a felony or a misdemeanor in New York or any other state? Have you ever been charged with a crime in New York or any other state? Have you ever had a professional license in any other state revoked? And have you ever lost professional privileges at a hospital or any other type of setting? The answers to those questions, someone answers yes. Most people answer no. So there's nothing for us to worry about, nothing gets flagged on an application. Someone who answers yes has to include with their application an explanation of what happened. Why were they arrested? What was the court decision? Did they serve time? Did they pay fines, restitution? What have they done since then to rehabilitate themselves? And sometimes, sometimes these are pretty innocuous. Outside of licensure, we do some other things where people have to attest to this. Someone responded yes. Their explanation was that they were part of the March in Washington in 1968 against the Vietnam War, and they were arrested by the Capitol Police. Well, I think that's pretty safe. It's safely in the distance, and of somewhat minor consequences. That didn't even require much of a first look. But we also have people who, 2 years ago I was picked up on a DUI, and we need to know, was that your first DUI? What were the circumstances? Have you gone into treatment? Was this just a one-time thing? We need to have that type of information to look at that to see, is the person of good moral character? And we've had people who've committed very serious crime, forgery, assault. In these professions, in creative arts therapy, fortunately, we've had very few. But we see a lot in other professions. And as they get more serious, we have to take more serious actions, look at things more closely. So we've got a process set up where members of the board review it and do a telephone conference, and they can clear some of them. Sometimes it has to go to a hearing where someone has to come in and they have to prove to the department that they're a good moral character, and they have to show what they've done with, did they show remorse? Did they rehabilitate themselves? Did they pay restitution? So it's not something that affects a lot of people, but that's a question that's not only on our license application, but it's on your registration application every 3 years. And I just want to highlight it because we have situations every now and then when someone doesn't report something on their license application, and we find out later through one way or another. And then it becomes a more serious question because then the person didn't answer truthfully on their application, so it has to be looked at a little bit differently. And some people have lost their license because they failed, they filed a false document by saying they hadn't been convicted. Again, so something that might have been minor could generate to become something even more serious for the person. And again, so I know all of you are good moral character, so consider yourselves, warned, and just something you can pass on to people, in psychoanalysis or psychology or other professions, that don't meet those requirements. If you do classes with mental health counselors, start asking them, hey, are you a good moral character? When do you apply for licensure? Again, the memo that's in your packet sets out a lot of this with a lot more information. But you can apply while you're still in school. Get your application in. Actually, how many of you are going to graduate in May? Yeah, so you should be thinking about getting your application in now. Send in your application and your fee, and that starts your process. When the education comes in from your school, that goes in, and that means we can approve you then to take the examination whenever you're ready to take the exam. It means that you're eligible for a limited permit, and the limited permit, allows you to get experience. So starting now is a good idea. And I'll talk about the limited permit because that's how you complete the experience that you need for licensure after the degree. I'm going to take this slide out, I think, because I could have been saying this for the 12 years I've been at the department. The only difference is, well, no, she's not even using a laptop, so that's not even different. We still have a paper-based system. You have to print off the forms off our website. They're all PDF documents. We don't even print application packets anymore. We just put it all on the web. You print them out, you complete them. Where appropriate, you have your signature notarized or your permit supervisor or your signature notarized. And that paper is sent to us. Now the good news is my office was one of the first to start having all of our paper scanned. So it's scanned into a system, it's tagged, and then it's all made part of your record so that my office can see it, the education office can see it, the licensing office can see it, the discipline office can see it. If any of us need to take any action or do anything or review anything. So we've streamlined part of our process, and for those of you who went through the initial grandparenting and licensure piece, and I used to have pictures of staff in the processing unit holding big mail buckets of applications that had to be processed, and we had thousands of applications that we tried to sort in chronological order, and then we couldn't find anything, so then they all got put in alphabetical order, which made it easier to find, which meant whoever might have been next in line might, their last name started with Z, they were down the back of the line. So e-licensing lets us get all that paper in, it's not lost that way, and we can find it in the system. So we just had a demonstration the other day from a project that's ongoing to try and create an online application process for us, and that's still under development. So one of the big changes in the last year is related to limited permits. A limited permit is the equivalent of a learner's permit when you're learning to drive. This works out well because I think when I came here 2 years ago, my daughter had just gotten her full license, and this week my son got his full license as a 17-year-old. He had to go through driver's ed. He had to go, as part of driver's ed, he had to do driving in the car under the instructor. Then when he finished, he had to complete a certain number of hours of supervised driving and had to pass a written test in order to get his driver's license. Well, the limited permit is sort of the equivalent of that training license that he had while he was getting road experience. It's issued after you've applied for licensure, we've approved your education, you can submit the application for a limited permit. And what's changed recently is the initial permit is now valid for 2 years, and you can apply for 2 one-year extensions if you haven't met the experience requirement or the examination requirement in that first 2 years. So you could have up to 4 years to complete those requirements, which is why your association joined with others, the other mental health associations, to get this law changed to give people more time. Because in the job market, a lot of people were finding part-time jobs, and they were having difficulty able to accumulate 1,500 hours of post-degree supervised experience. And this change gives them 4 years rather than the old 2, which should make a big difference. I'll talk a little bit about the setting in a minute. And again, your supervisor has to be employed in the setting, and they have to be licensed as a creative arts therapist or another profession that can provide creative arts therapy if competent. That would be medicine, generally psychiatric nursing, clinical social work, and psychology. When you get a permit, we post that up on our website so people can see that you've got a permit to practice in a specific setting under a specific supervisor. And you can only practice when the permit is issued, not when you put it in the mail, but when we've looked at it and approved the setting and the supervisor. So when you're under a permit, you have to complete 1,500 clock hours of supervised experience. And that experience is in the practice of the profession as it's defined in law. The regulations that address the permit say that out of those 1,500 hours in that setting, at least 1,000 of those have to be direct client interactions when you're doing creative arts therapy and psychotherapy with clients. The other 500 hours in that setting can be related activities like record keeping, case management, when you're getting supervision or when you're involved in professional development as assigned by your permit supervisor. The goal of the permit is to try to get, the ideal experience is you get one job after you get out of school, and in that job you get all 1,500 hours of experience you need. It's in a setting that does a lot of creative arts therapy and a lot of psychotherapy, and it provides you the opportunity to develop other skills that are related to practice, skills that are important like case management and collateral visits, record keeping, all these things you have to do to provide effective professional service. You can't get one job where you're doing psychotherapy and another job where you're doing case management because you're not integrating the practice of the profession. And that's the goal, is to have you experience in the integrated practice of the profession. You're completing your experience. If it's something, you could be working in 2 settings. We can issue you a permit for more than 1 setting. It doesn't cost you any more money. It's just you've got another setting, or you've got an additional supervisor at 1 setting. But your supervisor, as you're completing your experience, that supervisor is responsible for keeping track of all your hours, however he or she wants to do it. Whether they've got a log or a calendar or what they use, they need to keep track of your hours, preferably every week, or every other week, because they should be providing individual in-person supervision that averages an hour a week. So 1 hour 1 week or 2 hours every other week, where they are discussing the cases and how you're handling those cases, because your supervisor is the person who's legally responsible for those clients. Your supervisor is the one responsible for their assessment, evaluation, and their treatment, and the supervisor is delegating to you those things that he or she knows that you're competent to do based on your education and your experience thus far. So when you first come out of school, your supervisor might meet with you an hour every week or an hour and a half, because you want to make sure, it might do a lot of sessions where you and the supervisor are both in the room with the patient providing the services, because he wants to make sure that you've got the skills that he knows or she knows that you need to have to practice creative arts therapy and psychotherapy. Not just put you in a room and say, okay, start and go, and come tell me if there's any problems, because that's not going to help you develop your professional skills, your professional knowledge. The questions you should be asking, the cues you should be picking up on, things that your supervisor should be able to know and do because they've been licensed and hopefully practicing for a while, so that they can provide you that additional supervised education in a way. But when you leave a setting, your supervisor should submit Form 4B, or when you've completed 1,500 hours. And 4B is our verification form, where the supervisor says, Samantha completed, 1,500 hours here between the dates of July 1, 2014 to July 1, 2016. And when we get that form, we will look at that experience. But we're not going to look at that until you've passed the exam. Because that's the other thing you have to do while you're under the permit, is pass the exam. And since most of you will probably be taking the art therapy board, traditionally that was given one time a year, at their annual conference. Because they're doing it for licensure here, they do it additional times for New York candidates only, I believe. And they've been talking about doing it on demand where you have to pay extra to be able to have it done individually. Once again, that 4-year time under a limited permit, let's say you had a 2-year permit and you did your 1,500 hours, but you had failed the exam, rather than having to wait until the following July or August, whenever ATCB was going to give that exam, and it would be past your permit, now you've got the ability to keep practicing under supervision while you're meeting that exam requirement. Again, supervision is, I went through all this without flipping the slides. And again, the supervisor is employed by your employer. You cannot employ your supervisor. You cannot go out to someone else and say, hey, I'm working at agency Y and I'm seeing clients and I'm going to do art therapy. Can you supervise me? How does that person outside know what you're doing, who your clients are, any of the information about your clients? They can't base it just on what you might tell them because you're new in the field too. You don't know what to be looking for. So that's why the supervisor has to be part of the agency. They have to have access to the records. They have to have access to the patient. And the patient has to know that the supervisor is the one who's responsible for everything that you do. And so if they've got any questions, they may need to be able to talk to the supervisor as well. Because, again, that supervisor is legally and professionally responsible for that client. Now, that doesn't mean the supervisor has to be on site at all times. This isn't one of those professions where we're saying, if the supervisor's on vacation, you can't practice today. You can practice, but there should be someone else supervising you there. And if not, then, there could be concerns about whether you're practicing without appropriate supervision. But, you don't have to have, the direct over-the-shoulder supervision. But again, the supervisor has to be part of the agency, whether they're already employed by that agency or the agency goes out and employs them separately to provide services to a set group of clients there. And we don't require co-signing of notes, which is a question we often get, but your agency might, whereas anything you put in the case record has to be co-signed by your supervisor. The setting must be authorized. Before there was licensure, as I said, anyone could provide psychotherapy and they could do it any place they wanted. When you've got a licensing law, that says that only people who are licensed under the law can provide the profession, and only businesses owned by licensed professionals can offer that profession. Now, there's some exceptions in the law, like a hospital. A hospital can employ physicians and other healthcare providers to work in the hospital to provide healthcare services. But there's ultimately at the top of the hospital CEO might be an MBA, but there's a clinical director who's an MD, who's responsible for all the medical services that are provided in that hospital. And then they've got a structure. The same is true in OMH clinics and clinics from the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities or Office for Substance Abuse Services, where they might have an MBA administrator, but they've got a clinical director who's responsible for those services. That's why those agencies have an operating certificate from the Department of Health or the Office of Mental Health, OPWDD, OASAS, that authorizes them to provide those services. If they don't have that, if they don't have, or they could be a federal facility, the VA. VA requirements are that you can be on the staff only if you've got a license. It doesn't have to be in New York, but it has to be in any state. The same would be true for West Point as a military U.S. facility. And then there's a little thing that we've got that's called the waiver of corporate practice, which is, which I'm going to save for a few minutes. One of the things you need to be clear about as someone who's especially looking at art therapy within the practice of creative arts therapy is there is a professional certification you can earn from the Art Therapy Credentialing Board, but you need to worry about the requirements to get licensed in New York State. So, you know, you can't, we've had situations where people worked in an agency, but it turns out that their supervisor was a credentialed art therapist outside the agency that they, quote, went to for supervision. Now, as I said before, that person doesn't really know the patient or anything about the patient, and that person is now treating a patient through you without the patient's consent, with information that you didn't have the patient's consent to reveal, which is a violation of state and federal privacy laws, and they're providing treatment without actually seeing the patient themselves to make the determination. And we've seen a lot of doctors and other people arrested for, just writing blanket scripts for people for steroids or for antidepressants or for anything, and just handing them out to people just who called them or sent them an email or even operated through an online system. So while the art therapy credential is important and valid, don't confuse the two requirements. You need to make sure that your supervisor is licensed in New York State, that they're employed by the setting. Also, you're eligible for the exam when we tell you you're eligible for the exam, which was your application, your fee, and your education. You don't have to meet the Art Therapy Board requirements to take the exam. You have to meet our requirements. They won't let you take the exam until you have a certain number of hours completed, and a certain number of those hours have to be under a credentialed art therapist. You can worry about that credential later. You need to worry about your license first. And you need legal experience in New York. And again, we don't like it when we have to tell people, you just spent 2 years doing something that doesn't count. But we have to do that when they do something that doesn't comply with the laws and the regulations. And this is one of the areas, unfortunately, where we've had a lot of confusion in the past, and I think it's changing because people are learning more about the professions and the requirements. But again, you need the limited permit, and you need the qualified supervisor in the authorized setting. And I tell these horror stories just because if I can help one person from avoiding making a mistake, I feel like I've done something with my day. As I said, there's hospitals and clinics, and there's all these other places that have operating certificates and license from state agencies to provide services. What we found as we were after we'd implemented this law is that there are a lot of other places, churches and not-for-profits and psychotherapy institutes, and Institute for Expressive Arts, these different types of places that had also been providing professional services to the public, but they weren't a professional corporation. They didn't have an operating certificate or license from any state agency. They just had been doing it before the law took effect, and they didn't stop doing it after the law took effect. So in order to avoid having to shut down all of those places, the legislature gave us the authority to issue a waiver from the corporate practice restrictions. And the waiver from the corporate practice restrictions allows that not-for-profit to employ a licensed creative arts therapist and to employ a permit holder in licensed creative art therapy under that supervisor, or to employ a psychologist or an LCSW or any other licensed profession that their charter ordinarily would not have allowed. So it lets them continue to provide those services. When our office in the city used to be off 32nd Street, I'd come out of Penn Station and I'd go walking toward Park Avenue, and first place I passed, St. Francis Church, with a big sign up front saying, marriage and family therapy and psychotherapy and counseling offered, come on in. Church does not have the ability to offer professional services. That church couldn't offer psychotherapy any more than they could run a medical clinic. They need to have authority. And this waiver gives them the authority to be able to apply to the department, We issue them a certificate that can be verified on our website that shows they're authorized to provide professional services, to employ licensed professionals. They're being held accountable, because otherwise they were accountable to no one. They were, maybe accountable under a church hierarchy, but that doesn't necessarily protect the public. Same with the not-for-profit that reports to their board of directors, but if it's, maybe they got some civil liabilities, but they didn't have the authority or the accountability, which is what this this waiver provides. There's also another waiver that was implemented in the last year or so that's similar, but it's for early intervention services and special ed services provided to children 0 to 5 years of age. Again, those programs have already been approved, had previously been approved by the Department of Health and/or by the State Education Department, but a lot of them were for-profit businesses. And a for-profit business cannot own a professional corporation or employ licensed professionals. But they've been providing early intervention services, including art therapy and psychotherapy to children 0 to 5, families. They didn't have the authority because they had the wrong structure. So they've got a waiver, and again, those can be verified on our website. And again, that's just one more way that we're trying to protect the public by making sure that these people that run these agencies are accountable to allow, and again, the purpose, even though these laws are long-standing, the purpose is to make sure that the licensed professional is the one who's in charge of making decisions about treatment. Because if you put an MBA in charge of services, they're going to worry about what's the bottom line. How can I provide the service cheaper? They're the ones who we see telling people, you can only take 5 minutes with every client, you can't take 10. Or your sessions are going, too long, or you're providing too many services. We need to cut the cost. You need to do it the cost-effective way versus what each of us as licensed professionals to do, which is to do it the professional way. We're in compliance with that said. Again, once you've had some experience, you can take the exam. Again, most of you will be taking the creative arts, or not the creative arts, the art therapy credentialing exam. We get the scores. Once we get the scores, we look at your experience. If the experience is all there and there's not any problem, we can license you. If there's a question, we'll be in touch with you or your supervisor for some clarification. If you got part of the hours for experience and you pass the exam, submit those hours, and we'll still have to wait for the rest of the hours to come in. But even when you've submitted the hours, even when you've passed the exam, you can still only practice under supervision until you get a license. Again, the limited permit gives people that additional time. Hopefully the timing will be such that you don't need to apply for an additional extension of your permit after you pass the exam and get your experience into us. Once you're licensed for life in New York. The only way you lose your license is if the Board of Regents takes it away from you, or if you surrender it as part of a disciplinary action. You cannot even voluntarily surrender your license for non-disciplinary. As I said, the $196 you paid as part of that $371 is your initial registration fee. So if your license is issued in August of 2016, your registration will run through the end of July 2019. And after that, 4 months before that, you'll get a bill. It'll tell you how to go online to our website and renew your registration for the next registration period. What we do in that second registration period is we adjust your date of registration to the month before your birth month. So my birthday is in March. My initial license as a certified social worker was 96. It just expired at the end of February of this year because of each of the 3-year cycles, or the adjusted second time. So it's before my birth month. So one, it makes it somewhat easier for me to remember, but it also makes it easier for us because we've taken now 850,000 licensees across 50 professions and split them up into 12 somewhat equal groups. So we don't have some states, they issue all licenses or all registrations, say June 1st of every year or every other year. We've been able to spread all of our work out. And again, while the while the licensing application is online, the registration is, which is a big plus. And in bold here, the second big change in law is there will be a requirement for continuing education for people who registered after January 1, 2017. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. If you move during the licensing process, make sure you notify our processing units, because if all of your forms are going to your address where you're living when you're in school, and then you move, we can't get hold of you, tell you you're eligible for the exam, or we can't send your license parchment to you and it comes back to us from the post office, it's just going to delay the process. So make sure you change your address with our unit. And once you're licensed, you have to notify us as well, so we know where to send the bill for your registration. One of the big issues in all of these professions, again, anyone could provide these services before 2006. State agencies like OMH or OPWDD or OASAS, when the law was being enacted, said, wait a minute, our clinics, our hospitals provide psychotherapy. You mean our people have to get licensed? And we give operating certificates to lots of people who work in not-for-profits that provide services. You mean they have to get licensed? That's going to be a huge disruption. It's going to cost a lot of money. And so they got an exemption put in the original law. That exemption was set to expire January 1, 2010. That exemption didn't expire in 2010. It was extended until 2013. And they added a few other agencies to the group that hadn't been included in the earlier exemption. And they added the requirement that the department work with those agencies to conduct a study of the workforce that was licensed and not licensed in these agencies. We had to issue a report. Commissioner King issued a report to the legislature and the governor July 1, 2012, with recommendations for changes in laws, rules, or regulations to ensure appropriate licensure and public protection. And the governor's budget for next in 2013 proposed a permanent exemption from licensure. That was negotiated to July 1, 2016, and now I'm just finishing the first of two studies I've got to do before then, so that by January 1, 2015, Commissioner King can submit another report to the legislature and the governor about who is not licensed and why it's important that they get licensed, including what the cost impact will be on those agencies, as well as will there be any change, any positive change in client outcome as part of licensing. The exemption basically allows anyone in a program that's operated or regulated by OMH or one of these agencies to provide psychotherapy. Regardless of their training, the agency can assign them to do psychotherapy, and the law allows it. They can't call themselves a creative arts therapist. They really shouldn't say that they're doing art therapy, because that sort of implies that you are doing creative arts therapy. But they can provide services. They can run groups. They provide services to individuals. They don't have the training that you're getting or have received. To me, that's kind of scary that anyone can do that. The other piece that should be of a concern for people, and again, we don't advocate in the department, we just provide technical assistance. But if I go to a hospital, I know that the doctors, the nurses, the PTs, the OTs, everyone in that hospital has to be licensed in order to provide whatever services I need while I'm in the hospital. But if I went to a mental health clinic, I know the law says that theoretically there's a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a clinical social worker or someone responsible for clinical services, but no one that provides psychotherapy to me would have to be licensed. And whether that's based on the fact, well, in large part that's going to be based on the fact that these programs are paid for by Medicaid, which is why the state argues it would be a big hit for the state to pay higher salaries to employ people to provide psychotherapy And that would be a big hit on Medicaid, which becomes a big hit on counties because of the way we pay for Medicaid in the state. And therefore, you know, it's a bad idea and there should just be a permanent exemption from licensure. Well, that's, again, that doesn't solve the underlying question of whether you want to call it justice, or whether you want to call it public protection, that anyone in that facility can provide psychotherapy. And they might make certain decisions based on what they did before, or what they saw someone do before, or what they, you know, what the manual tells them to do. But if they don't have the professional knowledge to be able to assess that information, to make appropriate determinations, and to provide appropriate treatment, and to know, you know, my training was in, you know, social work administration and policy, but even I know that there are certain, you know, therapeutic interventions that you should use with some patients that you should not use with others. And I don't know to what extent that is even, you know, how that plays out in a lot of these agencies. So your association, along with you know, associations for mental health counselors and social workers and others, pushed back last year, and that's how we got the, you know, the 3-year extension of the exemption rather than a permanent exemption. So, you know, I'm sure Samantha will be happy to send out information to folks as, you know, the next legislative session comes up and this becomes a topic, because yours are the voices that legislators need to hear about, one, why you went to school to do this, and two, how what you learned in school and your supervised experience and in your years of practice qualifies you to do this, and why it's not just handing someone a box of crayons and a blank sheet of paper to start writing on or drawing on. If someone gets their experience in one of these exempt settings without a permit, we can look at that and see if it's acceptable. But again, the purpose of the limited permit is to protect you and protect the public by making sure that you're accountable and making sure that you've got a qualified supervisor and making sure it's an authorized setting. So everyone should, and you can use restricted titles. You can say, I'm a licensed creative arts therapist, limited permit holder. I'm practicing a profession under supervision. And you know, that provides, one, I get professional identification, and two, helps the public know who you are and what you're doing and who's responsible for what you do. So let me just briefly talk about the continuing education requirement. As new students, you will not need to worry about this for a while. No one will have to worry about it until 2017. But anyone who gets their first license after January 1, 2017 won't have to do it during the first registration period. There's that first registration period, grace period. But if the law will require each licensed creative arts therapist, mental health counselor, marriage and family therapist, and psychoanalyst to complete 36 hours of acceptable CE over the 36-month registration period. So it's the equivalent of doing an hour a month. But no, you don't have to do an hour in each month. That's how we've got the number. The provider has to be approved by the department. So an association or other group will have to apply to the department, meet the requirements, the standards that are set out in the regulations, and we'll have a 3-year approval to offer however many continuing education programs they want to creative arts therapists. The individual who's licensed will have to complete, it's going to prorate it. So let me step back. Social work's got a similar law that takes effect January 1 of next year. So we've actually got regulations that are out. Public comment period ends tomorrow or Monday on those. That would implement that. So my license, I just registered my license end of February 2014. So my next registration will be the end of February 2017, which means that I will need 1 hour a month for every month from January 1, 2015 until February 28, 2017. So I need essentially 24 to 26 hours of CE during that next registration period after January 1, in the time after January 1, 2015 until I go to register again. And then after that, it would be 36 hours. So it's prorated. Someone who's licensed next license registration after January 2017 in these professions, if it's 2 years later, it's 24 months. If it's 12 months later, it's 12 months. That's why I like the 36, because it makes math easy when you're dealing with single digits. By that time, the original law didn't have provision to allow us to do regs in advance. The governor signed a chapter amendment which says that we can do regulations in advance. So my goal is that in sometime in 2015, we will be putting out regulations that would implement these provisions in law, so that we could approve providers before January 2017, so that come January 2017, licensees can take continuing education from approved providers. If you just want a sense for what it's going to look like, look at the regulations for physical therapy or massage therapy or the proposed regulations in social work. All the laws are similar, so all the regulations will be comparable. There's obviously going to be differences, things we haven't figured out yet, or I had an initial discussion with the state board at our meeting at the end of February, but that was just the initial discussion. So we'll be having a lot more discussion before we put pen to paper to develop the regs, and then they'll go out for public comment, and they require approval by the Board of Regents. So there'll be more to come on all of this. But there's the ability to adjust hours that someone has to do, or if someone doesn't complete all the hours that they need, they can get a 1-year registration to complete the deficiency. So there's all those provisions built into the law. Let me talk briefly about the practice of the profession. Again, when you're licensed, that gives you the use of the title. You can put after your name, licensed creative arts therapist. You can practice that profession. You can do psychotherapy using creative arts. It shows that you're competent. It shows that you've met minimum standards to be able to practice this profession. And it says that no one else can practice this profession unless they're a student under the student exemption as part of their internship, or they're a limited permit holder, or they're another licensed profession that overlaps. But that's the value of the license, because the legislature restricted the practice and the title. So when I've talked about the scope defines what you can do. So in law it says what creative arts therapy is, that you can use assessment, evaluations, and intervention using creative arts therapy, which is different from assessments, interventions, evaluations marriage and family therapists would use, which is different from what a psychoanalyst would use, which is different from what a mental health counselor would use, because it's unique to your profession. And that's why you're using the creative arts to treat the patient rather than another one of those modalities. You can use acceptable classification systems, the DSM, and you can administer tests and measures that you're competent to administer. You can't, there's no such thing as a psychological test or a test that's restricted to psychologists. But if you gave a test, you couldn't say you're doing psychology, you're doing creative arts therapy, and that's why you're administering a type of test or a measure. Even if it's something standard like a measure of depression or substance abuse or anything like that. You can get information about the profession on our website. We've got the laws, the rules, the regulations there. We've got answers about practice. We've got answers about limited permits. We've got answers about what do I do if I don't have a degree in creative arts therapy? What education requirements do I have to meet? How will my education be handled? All of those things are up on our website. And there's also, into the presentation, there's a link to our website, to our email. If there's questions about practice, you can get hold of us as well by phone and by email. And we put discipline information on the web. One of the things about these 4 professions is the law says that if you're providing services on a continuous and sustained basis for serious mental illness, which is defined in law, that your patient has to be evaluated by a physician in order for you to continue to provide services to rule out any biological cause of their depression, their ADD, schizophrenia, panic disorder, OCD. Make sure that there's no biological basis for that. Doesn't have to be a psychiatrist, but it has to be a physician. And, I mean, it may ideally be a psychiatrist, because the person might need medications as well. But that evaluation has to be done before you can continue to provide services to that individual. It doesn't cover any other conditions. It's only the ones named in law, which I know is difficult for some, but that was part of the agreements that were made when the legislation was done. And we've got a practice guideline on our website that goes into more details about this. What does the law not include? This has been an ongoing issue and question. Diagnosis is not in your scope. Diagnosis is in the scope for medicine to diagnose and treat, all conditions, all human conditions for the physician. Nursing diagnosis is in the scope. Diagnosis as a psychologist is in their scope. Diagnosis as a clinical social worker is in that scope. Dentistry is diagnosis, some others have diagnosis. But not a lot of professions have diagnosis. It's a word that was explicitly taken out of the bill before this law was enacted. So you can assess and evaluate, you can use the DSM, but when push comes to shove, you can't say that you're diagnosing. But again, you can use the DSM as a classification system. Your association and the other mental health associations have introduced legislation to address this. And again, Samantha can give you all sorts of talking points about why the law should be changed, so that you can discuss that with your legislators. Similarly, there's no mandate for reimbursement under the law, but that's a decision that's made by individual payers, and you're a new profession, so a lot of insurers might not know about you. Again, that's the benefit of a professional association, is they can schedule those meetings and they can have those discussions representing all of you as a statewide organization to say, look, we're out here, these are our qualifications, this is what our license says we can do. We can do psychotherapy too. What do we have to do to have our services reimbursed? And, some insurers might take it at that, but there's a bill, again, that the 4 associations have worked on, that's in the current legislative session, that would put that in the law. Again, it's, as the Affordable Care Act and implementation of that rolls out too, you're defined as professions that provide professional services, so that, again, provides you another opportunity to try and make sure as an association you're represented in there. And there's no protection under the civil practice law, the court rules, about confidentiality as there is for some other professions, including clergy and lawyers. But that doesn't mean you don't have to treat information as confidential, because you still have to treat information as confidential. It's just not the quote, protected. I told my priest, and therefore you can't make him tell anything about what I said. You still have to keep confidential, and even those protections can be waived in a court. One of the other things I mentioned earlier when we were talking about corporate practice, licensed professionals, you can provide services as a licensee, as an employee of an organization, or you can set up a private practice of your own, where you can provide professional services. Generally, if you're going to do that, you should create a professional corporation, work with an attorney who knows how to do that, or a professional limited liability corporation that's got, they have lots, they have protections for you, because that becomes the individual who becomes sued, who becomes liable, as opposed to you personally. So your attorney or CPA can help you with all sorts of questions about how you incorporate or how you become a professional business. But if you incorporate, it has to be through us as a professional business, and there are certain restrictions. You have to use your profession in your name. You can't call it. You can't be incorporated. You have to be a PC or PLLC. One of the provisions of this law is, if you were going to form a professional corporation, you could form it with other licensed creative arts therapists. So if you had an art therapist, a music therapist, a dance therapist who wanted to form a corporation together, they could do that. and that becomes, creative arts therapy for all, and it provides creative arts therapy services and any other legal services. You could not have as a member a mental health counselor or a marriage and family therapist or an occupational therapist, because when the legislature passed this law, they put this restriction in that individuals licensed in these professions can only form business partnerships with people licensed in the same profession, because that's what applies to medicine and psychiatry, applies to dentistry, it applies to vet med, and it applies to LCSW. There's a bill, again, that's being worked on by social work as well as by your associations that would change that, either to allow you to form with other professionals, or with other mental health professionals. And if you're a licensee, you can employ other licensees, and you can employ individuals with a permit. Your professional business is an acceptable setting for people to get experience. But again, you couldn't employ anyone in any other profession, nor could you employ anyone who's not licensed to provide any service, which is, again, where the whole early intervention problem came about. Couple quick points. Again, licensing is to protect the public. That's why the legislature enacted it. They didn't enact it because they just wanted to give more work to the department. They didn't enact it just because it seemed like a nice thing to do. They enacted it because they reached a point where they could recognize, one, that the practice of psychotherapy needed to be restricted, and two, they needed to authorize the right people to be able to provide those services. So that's why they passed this, that's why they signed this law. So the law defines what is unprofessional conduct in the practice of the professions, and it includes a number of activities. As I said, don't tell us you had a previous conviction and arrest on your licensing application. That could be getting your license fraudulently. That's misconduct. Practicing beyond the authorized scope or with incompetence. So if you're doing things that you're not trained to do, or things that are outside of your scope, there's extreme examples that are specifically prohibited, like doing an invasive procedure. If you were using a blue laser to try and change something for people, that would be beyond your scope. Practicing while impaired by alcohol, drugs, physical or mental disability. If someone does have a substance abuse problem, we have a program of a professional assistance program where that licensee can come in and surrender their license, get treatment, get sober, and then get their license back without it being recorded as discipline. If they've harmed a patient, they can't get into the program that way. But it's a way to try and help treat the addiction and allow someone to keep their professional license. Conviction of crime or misconduct in New York, another state, or under federal law. As I said, these are questions that are on your registration application, and every 3 years. And this is any New York State law. It's not just any New York State education law or any New York State health law. It's any law. I don't believe we have taken any, I don't believe the regions have taken disciplinary action against any creative arts therapist yet. There might be one, I can't remember. But when they take action, it goes up on our website. And, the most frequent one we see is someone had a DUI. And yes, you might not be practicing when you're out having that pizza party and pizza and beer party, but getting arrested for a DUI becomes professional misconduct. And it's dealt with, with a fine, but it becomes part of your record. So anytime you apply for a job, yes, you've been, where you're using your license, yes, you've had disciplinary action. Anytime you apply to an insurance company to become a participating provider, yes, you've had professional discipline against your license. So it's, anything, and aiding and abetting illegal practice is professional misconduct. I was in New York City for 4 days in March waiting to testify in a federal trial for a psychologist who was employing unlicensed people, calling them social workers, and billing no-fault insurance for psychotherapy provided under his supervision. I didn't think I had that big a part in the trial. I testified for probably an hour or so for the federal U.S. attorney. And when they contacted the FBI agent, called me after the trial was done. He said, yeah, the jury deliberated all 14 minutes before they came back and found the psychologist guilty, because it was very clear that he was using unlicensed people to practice the profession to bill fraudulently. So again, that gets right to the heart of it. You're hurting your own profession as well as your consumers. You know, fee splitting, moral unfitness, Regents regulations define additional things. Advertising not in the public interest, failing to wear a name badge in a healthcare facility, prescribing drugs. And again, that can even be something as simple as you're seeing a client who says, well, the doctor's got me on 30 milligrams of Elavil every day, and I just really feel lethargic and I can't get motivated and this and that. And you say, well, cut the pill in half. You know, try it that way. Well, you're not a doctor. You can't give that advice. You can't say, when I did that, I cut the pill in half. Or other clients have said they cut the pill in half. That's considered, making as if you're administering or prescribing a drug. So even something you think simple and just being helpful, the answer is you need to talk to your primary care doctor about that issue and see if he can adjust your dose. You need to tell him how you feel and what you want. All complaints received by the department, they go through investigators, they work with members of the state board that are participating in the process to help clarify whether or not it's a practice of the profession or what someone's engaging in. There's often an informal settlement conference, and there's disciplinary hearings when we need them. This is an important role for our board members. And for some of the licensees here, one of the other things is sometimes I get a call from an investigator needing a consultant about practice. So I'm always looking to create a list of consultants who might be available to come in and testify in a disciplinary hearing. If needed. Final actions are all up on the website. So the next slide is only my contact information. So with that, why don't we go into questions? I've already talked longer than I was supposed to. They'll be collecting cards. Okay. Okay, let me jump right into these while I continue to write.
I'll stand by to collect it.
Yeah, they'll keep going. We don't have dead air on the videotape. This question is a memorandum of understanding still used for an off-site supervisor? It's not really a memorandum of understanding. It's an employment agreement between the agency and the supervisor and the permit holder that supervisor will be working for the agency and will be providing treatment to clients and supervising the permit holder in the treatment of those clients, and assessment, evaluation, and treatment of those clients. So that they have access to all the records, they participate in case conferences, they meet with the client, they are professionally and legally responsible. So whether or not or how much different colors on each side, I've never seen that. I should have known in the creative arts center so yes, there is a process by which the employer can employ a supervisor if there is no creative arts therapist on staff or no one qualified to provide that. That has to be submitted along with the limited permit application, and this is one of the questions that's on our website. It's got some of the key factors that need to be addressed in that agreement. Okay. When can we take the ATR board exam? After the 1,500 hours or in the process of obtaining. You can take it while you're completing hours. You don't have to wait until the end of the 1,500 hours. A lot of these exams, because they're being used for practice, you might have a better chance if you've got a little bit of practice experience under your belt. But you need to look at the exam development, the questions, the areas that it tests, and make an assessment yourself and talk to your supervisor or people you know who are certified or licensed and say, here's my experience, is this enough to help me get ready for this exam? But you can do it any time during then, so you can still be completing hours. What if we don't have a job for a while, but we've already applied for licensure? Should we still apply now? Do we start? So you can apply now, get your application in, get your education in. The clock for the limited permit doesn't start until a permit is issued. So if you want to take time off to travel or just recuperate from school, or if you're just having trouble finding a job, that doesn't count toward the 4 years that you have under a limited permit. The permit clock only runs when a permit is issued. So you go, you find an employer, make an agreement. They have to sign that permit application before you start there for us to be able to issue it. And while we're processing it, you could be starting and having training and things like that where you're not practicing the profession. But even if you've got a permit and something happens, like you become pregnant, there's a new child in the family, serious illness for you or a family member, that you have to stop practicing, you can always turn in your limited permit to stop the clock and stop practicing. And then when you're ready to return to practice, we need a new application, not new money, just a new application for a setting and a supervisor. So yes, you can apply now and not move on to the next step for limited permit until later. What if you've been convicted of a misdemeanor over 10 years ago and it's been expunged? Do you still need to say you were convicted? Yes, and we still need copies of whatever documents you have, because that'll be reviewed. Again, something more than 10 years ago, and is probably not going to be problematic, but again, providing the information and having it reviewed is your best choice. And again, I was meeting with someone who was, the last thing I said was, what about moral character? Anything you need to tell us? And it came out that there'd been a drug conviction when he was 16. And he said, oh, it was 16. I was told I didn't have to report it because I was 16. Well, he did have to report it. And when we got it, it was more serious than was seen. And the other person ended up with just an administrative warning. But it was something that had not been reported and then brought into a discipline process that he would not have chosen on his own. How should hours in the limited permit be organized and documented? You have to be specific about what you did. No, the supervisor just has to tell us how many hours you completed. And he doesn't have to break down the hours that you did. So if you did 1,500 hours, when he signs that statement or she signs that statement, they're saying it was in accordance with the regulations, which is at least 2/3 of those, 1,000 hours were direct client contact, and the others were other activities they assigned to you. It could be that they're all direct client contact, it doesn't matter, but they're testing that whatever they sign, at least 2/3 of those hours were direct contact. And the hours that they put on the 4B is what we will use. Can a limited permit supervisor be employed by the same facility but practicing elsewhere, have access to all patient files, and sees patients one-on-one off-site while creative arts therapy sessions are held in groups of the facility? Probably not. Because when you say this, that a patient of an agency is being seen off-site, now they're being taken out of the agency. And why are they being taken out of the agency? because you as a recent graduate thought that they should be out of the agency. They're the agency's clients. You can't send the agency clients out to someone else to be treated. The agency is responsible for their treatment. As I said with the first question, if the agency wants to employ that supervisor to provide creative arts therapy on site to those clients, that's the way it should be done. And even if there's a creative arts, if you're in a hospital and you're in one wing, and there's a creative arts therapy and another, you're working with adults and they're working with kids, there's no creative arts therapy supervisor here and there on the other side, you can't make that arrangement yourself. Your employer has to make that arrangement because they have to decide if they want that child creative arts therapist treating adults, because they're the ones who are responsible for the patients in that facility. So you need to, that's why you need to be very clear with your employer. And again, healthcare settings, mental health settings, they've all dealt with health professions for years, so most of them understand limited permits because it's part of the licensing requirement for many professions that need experience. What is the best protocol to report someone practicing without a license? There's an 800 number on our website, but all complaints have to go in writing. So go to our website and fill out the form and provide all the necessary information, who the person is, how we get hold of them, what they're doing, and please try not to do it anonymously, because if it's anonymous, it's very, very hard for our investigators to know where to go to get additional information as the investigation proceeds. Sometimes investigations are dropped because we can't get information. If someone's a client of an unlicensed practitioner, the client should be encouraged to report it. And the second part of the question is the site liable if they're employing an unlicensed person? Well, again, if the site's exempt until 2016, generally they're not. That would not be considered illegal practice. But if the setting is not exempt and they're using an unlicensed person, then they can be liable civilly as well as they can be liable criminally for facilitating the unlicensed practice. How do non-LCAT supervisors prove competency? Again, they're attesting to the fact that that they're competent in creative arts therapy. We don't require that anyone have a certification. It's nice and it's one way to demonstrate competency, but whoever's going to sign as a supervisor needs to read the regulations and reflect on the fact that when they sign their name, they're saying that they're qualified to do creative arts therapy. And again, it's not just because they've got a box of crayons in their room. Can LCATs treat private clients online, for example, to Skype or FaceTime? For instance, if a client moves out of state. We have a guideline on our website that talks about a recent alert as well, that talks about online practice and electronic practice. Generally, the same rules apply to electronic practice that would apply to in-person practice. You have to be licensed in New York, and your patient has to be in New York. If your patient moves to New Jersey, you have to be licensed in New Jersey to treat that person, whether you drove to New Jersey to see them or whether you use electronic means to see them. And when you're using Skype or FaceTime, you're not using secure systems. And that means anyone can see your information. I just read an article last night about two people who were in an online facilitated therapy room. It turns out that everything was being copied down that everyone said in there because the fine print said this site's being run by this pharmaceutical company. And then they were able to send mailing coupons for drugs and everything to these people. And they had no idea that what they were sharing, they thought was part of a quote therapy group, was not protected communication, was being used for commercial purposes, and was being sold to third parties. So before you use any technology like that, you really need to think about a lot of factors that are outlined on our website. If a job is seeking an LCAT, can a limited permit be equally recognized? Yes, if they've got a qualified supervisor. And their benefit then would be that you're getting your experience there, and hopefully you will then stay there once you do become licensed. Can a permit holder be recognized for insurance? That's a decision of an insurance company, and again, their policies vary. They might say that they have a contract with the licensee who's providing services. They might have a contract that says services could be paid for if provided by the licensee or an authorized person under the supervision of the licensee. But those are the insurance policy questions. Is it possible to be supervised by a social worker to obtain supervision under a limited permit? Yes, as long as it's a clinical social worker and as long as they're competent in art therapy. Licensed master social worker cannot. In a lot of substance abuse programs, there's LMSWs like myself who are administrators. They might, under OASS regulations, be allowed to provide therapy, but under licensing, they're not. Can someone in an exempt agency supervise someone toward the LCAT? Yes, as long as they meet the requirements and regulation. Just because the law allows anyone to do it doesn't mean we'll allow anyone to supervise someone getting experience for licensure. What about people who may lie about moral character due to background checks? Right now, the law doesn't authorize background checks or fingerprinting, but that could change if the law changes, and that's done in many, many states now, where people have to pay to go through the federal and state criminal justice systems. And if someone lies about something, it's likely to come out at some point, whether they decide to tell us later or whether someone else tells us about it. Because we get reports from probation officers and courts throughout New York telling us that people were disciplined, especially for things after they were licensed. Do you apply for a permit after you get your first job? Well, again, you apply for the permit once you've got the job, you know that's where you're going to be working, and they're going to have the supervisor and who the supervisor is. Do you have to be a New York resident to be an LCAT in New York? No, you do not. You can be in any state. Whether your license qualifies you to practice in another state is a different question, but there's no residency requirement to become a licensee in any profession. And again, how do you determine someone's qualified to be your supervisor? I think we've got that already. If you have a practice and your client is seen with a medical doctor for certain health issues but does not address their psychiatric issues, is that still a conflict for the art therapist? Well, again, the law defines the serious and persistent mental illness as those 10 conditions in statute and in regulation. If you know your patient's got psychiatric issues and the patient is not telling those to the doctor, and you think that those should be evaluated by a physician, you should do everything you can to strongly urge the patient to discuss those with their physician, or ask for their permission, preferably get it in writing, that you have their consent to speak to their primary care provider about their health and their condition, in relation to the services you're providing, and document it in the chart. Because you don't want to have anything go wrong, and someone says, well, why didn't you knew they had an issue, you knew they had a doctor who wasn't aware of it, why didn't you do something? And that's where the burden would fall on you to try and demonstrate what part of good practice is not telling the client to get the appropriate medical treatment that they need. If you need to take the exam, need to retake it, it can be taken online. You need to talk to ATCB that administers the exam. I mean, I think that's what they consider their on-demand, or, but they've got retake policies. And if you pass the exam before you finish your hours, can you practice as a licensed therapist while still completing hours? No, because you must be licensed. So as long as you're completing hours, or as long as you're completing the exam, you're still only authorized to practice under supervision. You're not licensed until the license is issued. Okay. Can you have multiple supervisors? Is there a limit on the duration of time spent with each? You can have multiple supervisors just like you could be in multiple settings. We've had some people who've had, there were 20 hours here and 20 hours here. Different supervisors, different clients. Each one of those supervisors, though, has to provide an hour of supervision regarding the treatment of the patients being seen there. This one can't provide a half hour, this one a half hour. Between them, they say they give her an hour. They have to each provide an hour of supervision because that's what the regulations say. So yes, you can have supervisions. Is there a limit on the duration of time spent with each? Well, no, because the only limit is the 4 years to complete the experience, and the amount of time you spend in supervision is going to be decided by them. We do have a limit that no supervisor can supervise more than 5 permit holders. Because if each permit holder is responsible for, say, 20 clients, that means, and the supervisor's got 5 permit holders under him, that means the supervisor is now responsible for 100 clients and keeping track of the assessment, evaluation, and treatment of the 100 clients and whatever other clients he or she might have to take care of themselves. So that's why there's a 5-person limit to protect the public, that the supervisor is actually able to spend the appropriate time supervising. If you move out of state after 6 months to 1 year of getting a degree, do you still have to apply for licensure for part-time employment? Well, if you move out of state, you need to talk to whatever state you're going to go to. So if you know you're going to leave, you don't need to start the licensing process here unless you wanted to. Because you can complete experience in another state, so long as you're supervised by someone in that state who's authorized to practice psychotherapy and creative arts therapy. If you go to the other state and you're employed as a professional counselor doing mental health counseling, and you're not using creative arts therapy, we would have trouble accepting that as creative arts therapy experience. But that, again, the problem you're going to run into is, we were the first state to license creative arts therapists, and there's still relatively few, even though there's movement in, there's been some laws passed in other states, and there's movement in some others. But you can get experience in those states and send it back to us. So you still pass the same exam, you get licensed when you're living outside of New York State, in case you're going to come back. What constitutes a continuing education unit for an LCAT? That's something we'll be defining in regulation. In social work, we say a 50-minute hour is an hour for continuing education. But then, in PT and in the proposed, existing PT and massage and some others in the proposed social work, things like publishing a first-time book can be eligible for a certain number of hours, and publishing a peer-reviewed article could be worth a couple hours. And the first time you do a presentation like this, you can get credit for the 2 hours of presentation and the 2 hours you spent developing it. But if I took the same presentation and did it next week someplace else, I'd get 0 credit because it wouldn't be new. I wouldn't have to do new work to develop that presentation. But that's something that we'll be defining as we go through in the regulation. One of the pieces of the law that's going to be different is in, the law says out of the 36 hours, 12 can be self-study. Self-study is still activities that are done through an approved provider, but we'll have to define some of those things as we go through regulation. So if my second registration period begins March 2016, would I be responsible for CEs during that registration period, 2016-2019, or would it be 2019 to 2022? You'd be responsible for hours from January 1, 2017 through 2019. Complete those and test then on your registration you completed those number of hours, and then your next registration period would be 36. Regarding scope of practice, what would be another profession that would overlap as per the statement restricts practice to? Many of the professions we have, as I started with, social work and psychology were title protected. That meant you had to be licensed to use the title. That meant if you lost your license, you could go out and call yourself a psychotherapist and no one could do anything about it because you weren't using the restricted title. So many of the professions have a scope of practice that defines what an individual can do, as do these 4 professions, and then the other 4 traditional mental health professions: medicine, nursing, psychology, clinical social work. There could be overlap with some other professions. The law specifically addresses occupational therapy. It says occupational therapist. the counseling that they do does not require licensure, but it's also, they can't do psychotherapy. So there's, and as the number of professions changes, there's a new profession of the applied behavior analyst. They can do certain things working with kids with, or adults with autism or the autism spectrum, but they do it under supervision and they do it pursuant to a plan. So, and that's something that, you know, the plan's developed by qualified professional, so there'll be a lot of overlap in some of those things. But there's a number of professions that have scope, and often if you look at the back of the law, there's an exemption that says this doesn't restrict people whose scope overlaps with these services from providing those services. If an LCSW has a PC, can they employ me if I'm not a permit owner or partner owner? Yes, they can employ a creative arts therapist to practice creative arts therapy within the practice of psychotherapy and clinical social work. So it makes it a little difficult, but those activities in theory would fall within the same, you know, the same umbrella. But because the prohibition is on the ownership. Yes.
If that social worker had formed a corporation, then they couldn't or could?
They could, if they're competent in, you know, there's an assumption that they're going to be competent in creative arts therapy, because that's going to be part of their.
Mixed professions can't be within the same corporation.
They can't be the same. They can't be owners of the same corporation.
Well, one can work for you.
And that gets into a scheme of medicine is God, and medicine can employ or supervise any other profession. And as we come down the food chain, who can supervise who becomes a process of looking at the scopes of practice. So a clinical social worker can diagnose, so he can supervise someone who can diagnose or treat within psychotherapy. But again, the practice still is a clinical social work practice. They can't advertise it as an art therapy practice. It's a clinical social work practice. So they could employ a creative arts therapist. Do continuing ed credits only count when they're earned after January 1, 2017? Yes. What are acceptable CEUs, and is there a list of providers? Again, those are all parts of implementation and regulation. Regulations will say what a provider has to meet. We'll review the applications from them, and then we'll have the list of who the approved providers. I think I answered this one already. The protocol for completing hours on-site, outside of New York. And again, if the licensed professional counselor in New Jersey has an ATR and they're in a facility or they have a practice that the law allows them to employ you, or the agency to employ you to provide services, then you can be supervised by that individual there. But that's often a question of checking with the licensing authority, because they might require you to have some sort of a permit or temporary license. Will there be an additional fee for the CEUs? There will be a fee of $45 for each licensee every 3 years, which lets us get the staff to be able to process all the applications. And there'll be a fee of probably $900 every 3 years for providers that want to apply to become approved programs. So there will be organizations that approve programs or approve others to provide it. That's, again, those are facts that will be addressed in the reg. Those are the fees that are charged in comparable professions. Jody?
So as NIADA, the way that we hold an event like this and we offer ADA CEUs, would we have to be approved by the Office of the Professions then, not ADA, but NIADA would have to file with you to then offer a program that would count towards?
Well, unless ADA applied to us,
No.
and then they approved all the state programs. But again, these are all issues that we'll have to work out as we're
Okay, so
developing the
potentially
regulations.
ADA may be approved, and then us, by being an umbrella organization under ADA, it would be our CEUs could be used towards our ADA events as well as, you know,
But those are all the things that we're going to have to look at as we
Okay.
develop the
As
regulations.
well as we're affiliated now with the school. So, I mean, it could also fall under the umbrella of the school.
Well, the school
That
could
way,
apply
if
and be
we're-
able to offer
right, so-
CEU.
Oh,
And
okay.
again,
Yeah, usually.
the regs in social work and others allow courses, so if you took a 3-semester-hour course in a school, that could equal 45 contact hours. But again, those are all things we're going to have to work out as we go through the regulation process.
So what you were saying is like when I do my, or when I keep my, every 5 years we have to do 100 hours for ADA. And right now, those hours of CECs are not the same as what I will need in 2017. They may not be the same, or they might be.
Yeah, and we
So
won't
it
know
could
that
be
until
that I
we,
need to do 36 for my license and 100 for ADA.
well, again, our goal is always to try and simplify everyone's life. So again, those are all issues that we'll have to look at as we go through this.
So in time, that may be,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
But again, we're getting way in front of that
We
topic.
got a couple of years.
I gotta get social work done first.
We'll see you back here.
Time's running out, it's 2017
Believe me, I
around the
know.
corner.
Believe me. Yes.
If you take the test during your limited permit, where you complete your hours, is there like a time frame where the test pass expires or something that you have to finish your hours by in order for the test to apply?
We do not, the test scores do not apply, do not expire in these professions.
Okay.
There are some where they
Your
do,
hours,
but
however long it takes.
the hour, I mean, the test stays valid. Yes.
When we submit the application for the LCAT, and we can do it at the same time as the limited permit, so can we, because then that's about $441?
Something like that, yeah.
So can we can submit like just one check in for that, or does it have to be like
Yeah.
two separate?
There can be one check. Unfortunately, again, this is the problem with not having electronic licensing. You can use credit cards to pay for your registration once you're licensed. We don't have a system set up yet where you can use credit cards to pay for your application for licensure. But again, the permit's only issued for a specific setting, so so you don't submit the permit and the permit fee until you've got that specific setting.
So we find the job first,
Yeah.
and then apply for the thing?
For the permit, yeah. Okay. Was there a question back?
Yeah, you were saying that, like, competent clinical social workers can supervise a limited permit. What is considered a competent clinical social worker?
Well, again, it should be someone who's got training in creative arts therapy as well as psychotherapy. Because, and again, this is where,
Now, when you say training, it just means coursework and stuff, but not like a full, like, I mean, we have a couple master's programs
right.
for the art therapy. Would the competent clinical social worker just be someone who has maybe done workshops or continuing ed credits under art therapy, and then would that consider them and make them competent then?
What we use is a standard of, as a licensee, I have to know that I'm competent. And before I can say that I'm competent, I should be able to demonstrate that I've completed coursework or training or education or whatever supervised experience that gives me that skill, that knowledge, skills, and abilities to practice that. We don't ask people, the only thing we ask of people is when they sign the application, they're a testament to that. If a question came up after the fact and someone brought a complaint and said this person's, this clinical social worker is offering creative arts therapy service and they don't have any training, our investigator would go in and ask that social worker, please give me copies of all the training and whatever you've completed that you think makes you competent to provide creative arts therapy. And then that's what would be reviewed by a board member, and that's what could lead to a charge of unprofessional conduct for practicing beyond one's competence, doing things that might fall within one's scope, but they're not really competent on. And there was, like in some, just because it's broader, let me jump to MFT. There's an Association of Marriage and Family Therapists that does a national credential to be a supervisor. In some states, the supervisor has to hold that credential. We don't have that requirement, just as we don't require that your supervisor have the ATR in order to be a supervisor. In part because of the way all the professional structures are set up, as well as the problem we also found when we started these professions, the board wanted supervisors to have 3 years of experience before they supervised. Well, when all the licensees were just licensed, they didn't have or they had 2 years and not 3, so it was difficult for people to find supervisors. So we try to provide flexibility, but also accountability, so that if there's an issue, it's addressed as a complaint. Okay.
Just getting back to the approved providers for the CEUs and all that, can you get that after the fact? Like, if they're not approved initially, but let's say you're renewing your continuing ed credits, and they weren't really approved, but yet you did something that was substantial, or can they like find out and get the approval?
Again, that'll be something we'll have to deal with in regular. Typically, it's going forward. It's not retroactive.
And it only counts after January 1st,
Oh, after January
2017,
2017.
so it wouldn't be anything before that.
Right.
So you're saying before that, it doesn't?
Like anything that we have already now, like we can't save and use until like, it has to be anything that we attend or present starting January 1st, 2017 and going forward.
And again,
So nothing we do now is something we could save for our 36
I
that
agree
is.
with that. I'm talking about if you're renewing right now. So my question is, if I'm renewing and they're not approved, and you want to use it as continuing ed credits.
But that's ACTV, that's not autism.
and that's, again, those are things we'll work out.
I wish it was like, yes.
It's just, it's
Like one full column.
well, and again, I think there will probably be some of that, but we won't know until we do have the discussions to do the regs.
But then that's sort of the question I had asked was that if there were, let's say you need to re-register for March of 2014, so 2014, 2015, 2016, we wouldn't need it, and we would not need CEUs from 2016 to 2017.
Right.
But if it was next year, then from 2017 to 2018, we would have to take CEU credits in that 1 year period and earn 12 credits. Okay.
So I can't, if I attended this and I got a certificate, I couldn't use it because my law doesn't take effect until January 1, 2015.
Right.
So, but after January 1, 2015, then I could, if the provider's approved, et cetera, et cetera. There's gonna be a lot to do about it.
Do you think there's a possibility it'll all come together, like so that we don't have to have a board certification and a license?
Well, and again, those are the things we'll want to discuss and consider as we go through the process of developing regs and putting those out.
A little complicated.
And again, and like everything else, I'm the executive secretary for 4 professions on one board.
Right.
So it's also going to be the question of, do we deal with each of these as a separate approval process and everything else, or how are we going to do that? Let alone with crossover from one to another. Okay, another question in the back?
Yeah, and the exempt agency advertises the job as a coordinator or therapist. Somebody goes there. Is there any kind of certificate or license that you have in your facility that says you're exempt from this law or whatever? That, we're hiring you, but you're not going to get this license or position, so forth.
In order to verify that a setting is exempt, you should ask them for a copy of their operating certificate or their license or regulation from one of those agencies. And they should be able to produce that. Okay. We caught up on our time. Okay, one more.
If you are moving out of state, but you're going to still be in New York State for a period of time after you've gotten your degree, if you do want to work, if there are problems in taking employment and not applying for licensure.
Yeah. There would be a problem if you're practicing the profession without a limited permit, because you have to have a limited permit to practice creative arts therapy after you graduate. Even if you're not going to stay in New York, you still have to have some authorization. And that would be a limited permit, which you only get by applying for licensure. Okay. All right. You want to say anything in closing?
Thank you very much again to Dr. Hamilton for coming to speak with us today. We certainly got a lot more well-informed with all the new changes, as well as I hope the students really understand what the procedures will be once you graduate, and good luck to you. And again, NIADA is always available if you have any questions, or between now and whenever you are applying, you might forget some of the stuff that you heard here today or need some clarifications. Please reach out to us, newyorkarttherapy.org, and have a great day. Enjoy the beautiful weather. Oh, and also, I'm sorry, Sam, you're absolutely right. We have scholarships that are available now. The application is on our website. There are several different scholarships. This is the second year we're doing it. If you got a copy of our newsletter when you came in, it explains them all in detail, but we have several that will help, from everything from some professional compensation for applying for these different licensure exams, as well as some student application scholarships that you can reach out for. So please take a look at that and send them in. And anything else that I forgot? Are we good to go?
Dr. Hamilton's contact.
Oh.
Yeah, we got that one, okay. Again, that's the last slide in your packet with me. That's also the contact information from the board office.
And if you want to join,
You want to join NIADA, please?
yeah, see Gabby at the table out front, and you can join NIADA if you need to rejoin. And WADA as well has their table out here. Thank you, Tara. All right, everybody have a great day, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.
Excellent.